turn to the mock trial of oil giant ExxonMobil held by activists and journalists and scientists during the recent UN Climate Summit in Paris. We first hear from one of the chief prosecutors, environmentalist Bill McKibben.
Tell us your name and describe your work a little bit.
Yeah, my name is Sharif Whiteland. I live in Rain, Louisiana. Mostly I work at being a mom, but when I'm not doing that, I work with bridgetgulfproject.org, and we help people along the Gulf Coast to tell their stories about social and environmental justice.
Among other impacts of the oil industry, could you explain for a moment about what's happened as they've cut channels and things through the marshes and bayous of Louisiana?
Well, what's happened is Exxon and other oil industry, the other parts of the oil industry has cut these long pipelines that go crisscross, kind of like tic-tac-toe, like a fly swatter, the end of a fly swatter, across our wetlands. And to date, what happens is the salt water comes up through those channels, kills the root system on the wetlands, and then we have land loss. So we're losing about a football field of land an hour in South Louisiana, and we've lost 1 million football fields to this date.
And what does that mean when the sea level is rising and when storms like Katrina approach?
Well, those wetlands are our protection. They're a buffer zone for us. So when we have hurricanes like Katrina Rita that killed over 1,000 people come up, we don't have that level of protection that we would have, and it's stronger and hits harder, and there's far much more flooding because they actually soak up that water.
As a political activist, the CEO of Exxon recently donated the maximum amount of money possible to two congressional candidates or members of Congress on the eve of an important vote. Why is it that you've not decided to donate $10,000 at a crack to congressional leaders?
I don't have $10,000 because I'm busy buying sandbags to keep the water out of my front door. I mean, like, we just had a couple more
Do you think
generations here, and where I live is going to be completely underwater.
Do you think a political system should be open to people handing $10,000 checks to...
I don't. I think Exxon's corporate serial killers. I think they're murderers. I think they need to go on trial, and I think the death penalty needs to happen.
Thank you very much.
Could you please state your name and your work?
My name is Sandra Stein Gruber. I am a PhD biologist and a co-founder and members of Concerned Health Professionals of New York.
You are a specialist in the impacts of fracking. Could you tell us about Exxon's involvement in the fracking industry in the United States?
Sure. So Exxon is the world's largest public natural gas producer, and it extracts oil and gas via fracking all over the world, particularly in the United States, but more recently it's gone after the shale gas and oil in Argentina.
We've talked a lot about local health impacts of Exxon's activities, and we'll come to that, but I also would like to ask you about the climate impacts of fracking, since we are here outside a climate conference. Sometimes natural gas gets marketed as a climate solution. Is that the case based on your expertise?
Natural gas is a climate problem. In fact, it's a catastrophe for the climate. So in addition to the deceptions that ExxonMobil has precipitated regarding the actual existence of climate change and the role of fossil fuels, Exxon is also implicit in promulgating the idea that somehow natural gas is a more friendly fossil fuel than the other two members of the unholy trinity, oil, gas, and coal.
You are a mother of 2 children. You have written about motherhood and the responsibilities to future generations. When you learned that Exxon had been researching climate change since the 1970s, research that has been described here today as state-of-the-art, did you have a reaction as a mother or as a scientist? Up to you, or both?
I immediately had a reaction as a scientist because I myself was studying climate change and what we then called the greenhouse effect as early as 1977, when I was first introduced to it by my biology professor. So we in the scientific community have known about the reality of climate change for a long time. As a mother, I know that there's no bigger threat to my children than the dissolving climate. And the disinformation campaign, perpetuated by many, but most notably Exxon, makes it difficult for me to do my job as a mother. I believe that all tasks of parenthood fall into one of two categories. We are called upon to plan a future for our children and to keep them safe from harm. And climate change makes that impossible, makes both of those tasks impossible. So climate change, the climate crisis is really a parenting crisis, which is to say it's a human rights crisis. And for Exxon to be involved in the disinformation about the science of climate, which we in biology have known about since the 1970s, is a strike against parenthood and a strike against human knowledge and scientific progress.
Thank you.
My name is Antonia Juhas. I'm an oil and energy analyst, the author of 3 books on the oil industry, and an investigative journalist, including numerous investigations into ExxonMobil.
Some of your work has talked about the connection between the oil industry and foreign policy. And would it be safe to say that the oil industry plays an important role in U.S. foreign policy?
Absolutely, a key and crucial role.
At this point, many of the early figures, many of the prominent figures in the war in Iraq, for instance, have said that it was a war for oil. Is that correct?
Absolutely. We've seen over the last several years increasing statements by those who were deeply involved in the processes of the decision to invade Iraq, to make clear that while oil was not the only or sole objective of the war, it was a clear intention and objective of the war. And as I have reported extensively, in that objective, it was exceptionally successful.
And did Exxon play some role in this politics?
ExxonMobil is a major funder of George Bush, as well as George Bush's father. And for those here who aren't from the United States, George Bush the Jr., the longest experience he had working prior to working for the government was working in the oil sector. The only other U.S. president to come out of the oil sector was his father, George Bush Sr. They were heavily supported by Exxon and the oil industry. Bush and Cheney, the oil industry spent more money to get them into office than it had spent on any election previously. And that immediately paid off, so that the oil industry was essentially able to stop lobbying and start legislating directly. And within a week of the Bush White House, Bush taking office, Bush and Cheney taking office, and of course, Cheney, the former head of Halliburton, one of the largest energy services companies in the world, they started meetings as part of the Energy Task Force, which laid out America and the world's energy future. But one of the meetings that took place within the Energy Task Force was early on, and this is in early 2001, looking at a series of maps and charts that were Iraq's oil fields, and a list that was called Foreign Suitors to Iraqi Oil. And this was other companies in other countries that were already in negotiations with Saddam Hussein for his oil fields. And he was in negotiation with these other countries because they were members of the Security Council. And if he could convince them to drop the sanctions, he would essentially let them have access to oil. Well, nobody from those countries was in this room. This was the US and British oil companies, BP and Shell, Exxon, oil guys from within the Bush administration, oil guys from outside of the Bush administration. And they essentially began the process of planning a war. One of the objectives would be to gain access to that oil, which they did, and ExxonMobil was one of the largest beneficiaries of that war, gaining access to the West Guarna oil field in Iraq, one of the largest oil fields in the world. Essentially, a country that was completely shut to Western oil companies prior to the invasion is now the home of Exxon, Chevron, BP, Shell, with Exxon being one of the significantly largest beneficiaries.
You've heard now a collection of witnesses from every corner of the planet. Perhaps, if it pleases you, a short summation from Councillor Klein and myself before your deliberations. We believe that the testimony makes it very clear that this is not just run-of-the-mill, usual corporate malfeasance. That this is not just Volkswagen turning back, resetting its exhaust controls. It's not the sort of thing that we've come to expect. Instead, this is a crime of the first order, and one that has carried the most severe implications for our planet and its future. You have heard eminent scientists explain that because of the delay in action caused by Exxon's failure to present the truth, we're going to see increases in the level of the sea, and you've heard from people who will be driven from their homes by that rise in the level of the oceans. It's hard to imagine a set of corporate practices that could have done more damage, and more damage needlessly, since Exxon knew, as we now know, early on, precisely what the problem that we faced was, the crisis that we faced. That crisis has grown over those 25 years, but over those 25 years, Exxon continued to maintain that architecture and ecosystem of denial and deception and disinformation. And for that, we ask for a judgment against Exxon and in favor of the future of this planet.
So we aren't asking you to put a price on that which is priceless. We have heard stories of lives lost directly because of melting ice. We have heard stories of ancient cultures threatened because of climate change. We have heard stories of the most reckless and discriminatory disregard for human life and human well-being and human health. It is Exxon's crime that it believes that money trumps life, trumps everything. So we aren't going to try to do the same thing. There is no price that can be placed on the Marshall Islands, on Arctic cultures, on the lives of our loved ones, on what we are unable to pass on to our children. But we have a duty to seek justice, and that is what we ask of you in rendering your verdict. Thank you.
If examinations by other authorities are able to document the pattern of abuse suggested by today's testimony, we judge that this will represent one of, and perhaps the most remarkable instance of corporate crime in human history. We note that even as we meet delegates from around the world are assembled in this city trying to work it out at this late date, some kind of governmental response to climate change, we note as well that their efforts continue to be hampered by climate denial and deception. We find the evidence persuasive and compelling that had Exxon 25 years ago merely stated publicly what its scientists already concluded, notably that climate change was real and perilous and demanded immediate action, then the world would have moved far more quickly and decisively, and extraordinary damage could have been avoided. We add in our capacity as individual judges that the burden of proof now rests squarely on this corporation to somehow prove that the documents and memos don't show what prima facie they seem to demonstrate, namely a profound disregard for the safety of the planet and its people. We render this verdict unanimously on the 5th of December 2015, the hottest year yet measured on our Earth.
That was actor and activist Peter Sarsgaard, part of the tribunal at the Exxon mock trial held in the midst of the UN climate summit in Paris, France, just a few weeks ago. The prosecutors, journalists Naomi Klein and Bill McKibben. If you'd like a copy of today's show, you can go to democracynow.org. Hi, I'm Amy Goodman. I want to thank you for tuning in to Democracy Now! We are so grateful to our fans and followers for being a part of the daily conversation. By choosing a news source that's committed to the truth, you're carrying the message of independent media, reaching hundreds of thousands of people every day. In these times of war and elections, we need a media not sponsored by corporations that profit from war, but a media that's truly independent, funded by you. Democracy Now! Is not paid for by the weapons manufacturers, the insurance industry, or the oil, gas, coal, or nuclear companies. We don't take advertising or corporate underwriting dollars. That means we rely on your donations to make our daily independent news hour possible. We need your support today to keep bringing you the hard-hitting, in-depth reporting you've come to expect 5 days a week. Visit democracynow.org, or you can call 888-999-3877. That's 888-999-3877 to make your holiday gift to Democracy Now! Today. Thanks so much for sharing Democracy Now! Stories all year long.